Welcome back, everyone, to Afrodo Reviews. And on this channel, I help you decide. Is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? What? Seriously? Middle of my monologue? Okay, come over here and cough. It's not all about you. You know that? It's not all about you. Sunwing is a book written by Kenneth Oppel and published on August 12th of 1999. The story serves as the forgotten sequel to a childhood favorite of mine called Silverwing, a book I did do on this channel, which details the story of a young Silverwing bat named Shade, who accidentally causes a war between owls and bats due to his desire to see the sun. There isn't too much to say in the background of this book, so let me just fill you in on some personal history of this book. Or this series in general, I suppose I should say. Sunwing was a sequel for a book I read constantly as a kid, Silverwing, and a sequel I didn't even know existed until until I was doing this channel and chose to do Silverwing as one of my nostalgic books about 2 years ago. So that's ultimately when it came up, so when I was deciding forgotten sequels, for all three of you who voted on the theme for this month, admittedly, I'm not taking that too harshly because it's taken me this long to get a video out that I didn't already have backstocked. I decided I wanted to do Sunwing because this was a story I had read so many times and yet I'd never read the conclusion to. And it did leave off with plenty of untied threads that, were really, really good to explore. The first book literally ends with the classic villain waking up after seemingly dying and vowing revenge on our heroes. So without further ado, and let's move on to the cover. The cover isn't bad. Now, I know there are a couple covers for this book, though I imagine the change is depending on the region rather than necessarily additions. I don't think the series was ever super popular personally. The book itself has a pretty decent art on the front that shows our main character, Shade, engaged into some kind of tussle with what is clearly supposed to be our main villain, Goth, the gigantic vampire bat. The size difference between the two greatly highlights why Goth is such an intimidating threat, while also the background sets the location of Goth's home turf this time, while an eclipse covers the sun, and though all things that are very relevant to the book and paint a picture of what's gonna go on in the story. So, thumbs up on the cover. But what is this book about, I hear you ask? Well, first I recommend checking out my first Silverwing review to get some insight and my basic thought on that book, because, it is the predecessor to this book. But for this book, the back of the book would have you believe. Shade, a young Silverwing bat in search of his father, discovers a mysterious human building containing a vast forest. Could his father be there? Home to thousands of bats, the indoor forest is warm as a summer's night, teeming with insect food, and free from the tyranny of the deadly owls. But Shade and his friend Marina aren't so sure this is paradise. Shade has seen humans enter the forest and take away hundreds of sleeping bats for an unknown purpose. And where is Shade's father? Before long, Shade and Marina are on a perilous journey to the far southern jungle, where the vampire bat Goth rules as king of all the cannibal bats. Now, Shade must use all of his resourcefulness to find his father, and stop Goth from creating the eternal night. And honestly, yeah, that's not too bad of a synopsis. It gives you just enough to intrigue, tell you what the stakes are, but not quite enough to spoil everything. It balances it just enough. For the sake of the review, you should know that the story contains various other characters, such as Ariel, who is Shade's mother, and Chinook, his bully from the first book. In addition, it's more accurate to say Marina makes a journey to the southern jungles, as Shade is dropped off there and they're separated for a good majority of the book. Too much more, though, would be a spoiler, so I'll fill in as needed later. So, the burning question. What did I think of this book? It's not bad, but admittedly I was a bit disappointed. Now, I can obviously chalk up some of that to the fact that, unlike Silverwing, Sunwing has no sense of nostalgia for me. Since I never read it as a kid, not in the same way I read the first book, which was at least 15 times. Like, just minimum. So I was looking at this with fresh, critical eyes. There was no rose-tinted goggle to this. I was able to just look at it as the story it was, rather than any memories connected to it. In addition, it is still a kid's book, so obviously it's going to do some things that I, as an adult, will find somewhat disappointing because it's for the kiddies. There are elements of this book I did like. For example, there's a sense of actual politics that exists within the strange world that Opal has created. While it's very simple, again, due to it being a kid's book, you do get a sense that there is a world that exists beyond our characters that we can see, as we see the various factions of owls, rats, and bats interacting and debating with each other, in addition, both internally and with the other factions. In addition, we see more of the relationships between how bats interact with humans, not understanding what they do or why they do it, leading to this interesting idea where we know what's going on, but the characters don't. I do also like that the author uses real world history, strange events to influence his story. To state what it is a tad bit of a spoiler, so I'll save it for later, as much as I do appreciate it, I do actually have critiques about what it does to the story. But I always appreciate real life history put in. That being said, again, like I said, I have a fair amount of critiques for this book. One such is how it handles deaths in this book. On one hand, I get why. But on the other, the first book was a lot more willing to show kids the danger that were presented by Goth, whereas this book almost seems afraid to have any actual impactful deaths throughout the story. We never get scenes that really match the same level of Goth's slaughter of the banded bats from the previous book, is what I'm saying. When he showed up with all those rings around him, it's kind of one of those cases where it's like, wow, we actually knew the characters from there, and we know what Goth did to them. That is awful. This book also has a weird mix of superstition and supernatural that, while it was somewhat endearing in the first book, it ends up getting a little confusing in this one. So I mentioned in my first review that I believe Silverwing was much more of a superstition-based book, where most of the bats' mythology was based simply off stuff they didn't understand that humans had created. For example, bats. The bands we put on them was some kind of mystical, strange thing that humans were marking them with, and they had no idea what it was. So we saw different colonies of bats reacting in different ways to it. Some thought they were cursed, like Marina's family, who tossed her out of the clan because of it. Others thought they were blessings, like the banded bat clan we meet in this first book, where they thought this was the humans marking them to turn into humans later. While another just more or less tried to ignore them. Maybe they were special, maybe they weren't, but the Bat clans didn't really care, as far as they cared. But I was surprised to find out that the story was far more supernatural than I remembered, as there were genuine magical elements as part of it, and they were actually a great deal more in the book than I remembered. I thought it was a little bit more like Warrior Cats, where most of the things the cats think are mystical is actually just something humans did. But there is just enough supernatural in it that you're like, okay, so something else is going on. So naturally, when this book tries to do a much more balanced blend of the two, it just ends up making a confusing mess. Like the first book is setting up all these prophecies that might occur in the future, involving various races and the coming war between bats and owls over the sun. And then just sort of says, never mind, that wasn't what I was really building to. They were never really going to happen. Now, you would think this is a book embracing the more superstitious elements rather than the supernatural elements, but no, it also kind of swings around the other way and does directly confirm that the two bat gods in this world do definitively exist. Zotz, the evil bat god, outright performs miracles on Goth that would be impossible to explain with real world logic. And Nocturna does something similar near the end. And this confusion also extends a little bit to the scale of this world. Now, this comes in two different forms. The first is, I'm confused on how strong the various animals are supposed to be. You see, the vampire bats are taking shelter in an Aztec temple, and at one point, as Aztec coded as they are, they sacrifice their prey by tearing out the hearts and offering it to their god before eating it. While the story presents only a surface level understanding of actual Aztec culture, as can be expected, that's hardly my point here. You see, one of the things that happens, we learn that they keep their prisoners on these ancient stone sarcophagi. Now, in the book, the lids are described to be so heavy it requires at least a couple humans to move it. And as you know from the mythology of the first book, humans are these impossibly powerful creatures to the bats. Yet, all it takes is a single stick and 2 vampire bats can now move the lid. Or 4 rats can. Or a couple bats and a couple rats can. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding the size of South America's rat, but this doesn't feel right. Another thing that confused me is the distance. The characters in this book cover vast distances, but there's never really a feeling of how far they've actually traveled. Now, in the first book, which is all about Shade trying his best to get to his hibernaculum, and the story is all about that journey, you felt every wing beat. But with this book, it just sort of loses itself in the scale. For example, at one point, Shade and Chinook are taken to South America in a helicopter, so Marina, Ariel, and Frida have to try and fly after them to save them. They arrive in what bats are called Bridge City, and the author's note helpfully tells us this is Austin, Texas. We learn that Shade and Chinook end up near Rio de Janeiro due to the description of the Christ statue, and again, thankfully explicitly spelled out in the author's note. Now, that's a distance of 5,000 miles, depending on the source. Now, somehow, Marina and Ariel cover that entire distance in an underground water tunnel built by rats on a toy boat, and it's done in a couple days. Furthermore, the nearest Aztec temple from Rio, which is where the vampire bats are staying, is in Mexico City, which is another 5,000-mile trip. So for the record, in this book, our characters travel over 10,000 miles before winter even comes to an end. Now, I know animals are very great migrators, but I'm willing to bet this is a little beyond the realm of power for silverwing bats. Or I think they're called silver hair bats in real life. In addition, I don't like the characters as much in this one. Marina feels less like a bat desperate to belong and finding a true friend in Shade, and feels more like she's nagging Shade at times. The back of the book outright says Shade and his friend Marina aren't so sure this is paradise, which isn't necessarily true. While Marina has her doubts, unlike Shade, she wants to accept this as a paradise, and she's willing to just ignore all the suspicions. She doesn't care about the suspicions, even after the bats go missing, which isn't something that Marina from the first book feels like she would have done. She was a lot kinder of a character. But that doesn't mean Shade got off much better. He's a lot more whiny and comes off as almost entitled at times. It's a little annoying to see him angrily rant at his god, Nocturna, demanding to know that why he has to be so special, and wishes he could just ignore all these calls to actions that he keeps getting. And it does work a little bit that the other bats call him out on the fact that, no, you can ignore them, you just choose not to. And it does work occasionally when he's relenting that he can't be happy and just accept what is seemingly a good thing. It doesn't work when he's just doing stuff that he could ignore. That, as far as he knows, there's no grand consequence to ignoring it. Ariel in this book, his mom, just doesn't feel like a character. Just sort of a tag along to remind us that Shade has a mom. In the previous book, she was a bit overprotective of him due to his small size. And it would have been nice to see her struggling to accept that Shade is grown up, considering she missed a great deal of that. But with this book, she's just there. Like, even the reunion with she is very much placed on a back burner. Even her reunion with her son after they're separated isn't anything of note, or a reunion with another character later on. It doesn't show any of the previous overprotectiveness or bond that she shared with her kid. But honestly, that's a whole problem with this book. Now, to talk a bit more in depth about my problems with this book, I am going to have to go further into details. So, here's your spoiler warning. And the pug farted. Let's move on. So, one of the inspirations of this book is a World War II project, Project X-Ray, or better known as the Bat Bomb. It was an idea that the US government experimented with when it came to using bats to deliver incendiary devices onto Japanese buildings, due to the knowledge that most of the buildings in their major cities were made out of wood and paper rather than concrete. This project was conceived by Little S. Adams, who apparently just had an axe to grind against bats, as he's quoted as saying something along the lines of, "The bats were the lowest form of animal life, and that, until now, reasons for its creation remained unexplained. Clearly, God just created bats specifically so he could turn them into living bombs against Japan."
Why are you the way that you are?
In any case, this project was eventually dropped because it was taking too long to develop. And as suggested by Stanley Platt Lovell, the bats were just sort of dropping like stones rather than flying out and spreading the incendiary devices as they were planned. Not that this deterred Adams, who would go on to claim that his bat bombs would have had the same devastating effects as the atom bomb, but without the massive loss of life. Again, dude, what the fuck? Am I witnessing an alternate future where Bruce Wayne's parents didn't die when he went to the theater, and this is him turning into a mad supervillain who just really has it out for bats? Is that what this character? Is this what this person is? Is that the timeline we live in? Is that why we don't have superheroes? In any case, history lesson aside, my point is the project notably has a difference from how the book uses it and how the history had it. The real-life project used timed incendiaries, specifically against Japanese buildings because they were susceptible to this kind of thing. While the book basically is just attaching landmines to the bats and sending them in. In addition, the humans have somehow cracked bat echolocation and communication and are pushing bats to specific buildings to explode. Rather than, again, like Project X-Ray, where the idea was just to let them roost and then set them off. While these creative liberties don't bother me too much, what does is, well, you would think this is giving us a timeline on when the world takes place, right? But no. What exactly is the war the humans are fighting in this book? This book takes place, as far as I can tell, in the modern time of its writing. Meaning that it would have been set in 1999, 2000 at the latest. Maybe 1998. But humanity is clearly at war, and they're bombing the shit out of Rio. To the point that they're resorting to using bat bombs to do it as opposed to conventional weaponry. There were never previous hints in the first book that humans were at war with each other. Even in World War II, I don't think we ever invaded Rio. So it sort of leads to the question of, what is the time frame? When in the world is this? What is this war going on? There's gotta be more going on. And while I complimented the politics, this one is confusing because it's one of those, this is informing your story. You have to explain it a little more. You can't just be like, yeah, humans are having war with each other, just normal business. Anyways, let's talk about the evil bat god trying to use an eclipse. Another issue I think I have with this book is it doesn't feel like a labor of love for the author. Now, obviously, this is me speculating based entirely on how I felt while reading this book. But when you read Silverwing, you definitely get there's a sense of love throughout the pages that gives us a sense of charm in several places. You feel like this is a story that Kenneth Oppel really wanted to write to tell people. Yeah. And I don't get that same feeling from Sunwing. Sunwing feels not necessarily like Oppel didn't want to write it, but rather that he realized he had no idea how to make it a satisfying conclusion, and instead of mulling it over, decided I don't really want to worry about it. I'm just going to end the story rather than whatever. And while this is definitely better than George, I'm just not in the mood for it for 14 years, Martin over there, this does have the downside of making the story feel lackluster. The defeat of Goth and the vampire Bat Haven doesn't feel like this big triumphant victory where bats, rats, and owls come together in a once-in-a-lifetime alliance to fight them. While Shade's moments in the battle using clever trickery to outwit the bats, there's never a ceremony to it. Goth ends up just sort of dying at a certain point. At another point, they blow up. And I shouldn't describe the fact of someone dropping a bomb on an Aztec temple and causing it to explode, wiping out a den of cannibal bats as boring, but it just kind of is. Another thing is it doesn't feel like any of the relationships in this book were really earned. In this book, Shade's old bully, Chinook, is now part of the cast and is presented as a romantic rival for Marina's affections, in contrast to Shade. Now, while this was clearly setting him up at first to take place in the antagonistic role again, the story then reveals that through Marina, that Chinook actually really looks up to Shade and desperately wants to impress the small bat, even admitting later on in the book that he only feels safe when he's with Shade now. Personally, I love the idea of exploring this. The idea of a bully becoming a staunch ally and friend, almost to the point that he kind of worships a person he used to pick on. And it was a wonderful dynamic to explore. Shane learning that his bully actually looks up to him, seeing him as a hero he wants to be, while also being a rival for Marina's affection, leaves a lot open to explore their relationship. How will Shade respond to someone who used to torment him, now constantly looking at him like he's a hero? How will Chinook make up for that? How will all this work? Oppel doesn't do anything with this. It's stated, and that's the new dynamic between them. That's it. Nothing about it is explored. Not really. Not in the same way that Shade and Marina was explored, or Shade's rivalry with Goth was explored. Again, it's just inferior version of the first book. We don't see Shade ever confront Chinook about his clear jealousy over Chinook courting Marina, which would have been an interesting reveal if I was writing this, I would say that Chinook didn't even really like Marina as much as he thought, but only thought he did because how much Shade liked her, and he was clearly trying to imitate Shade. We don't even explore the dynamic when Chinook's parents die in the story from being turned into bombs. Chinook just sort of says, "My parents are dead," and gets over it. And this isn't a problem that solely exists for the Chinook character. There's another character, Owl, who's named Orestes. He's revealed to be the son of the king of the Boreal Owls, and Shade ends up befriending him as the two save each other and come to a mutual respect with each other as they fight the vampire bats. So much so that Orestes goes against his father's wishes and begs for peace with the bats, now knowing they weren't responsible for the slaughter of the birds in the first book. And that's an interesting dynamic. It's a wonderful thing to explore. Through this relationship, we can see the differences of how the owls and how the bats saw their great war, how they saw the rebellion. We can see the prejudices both sides have for each other, both the legitimate grievances and the not so legitimate grievances. And it would definitely work with the much grayer tone Oppel seems to be trying to make the owls this time around. Again, no. Orestes is surprisingly barely in this book for having such a pivotal role. He shows up once, near the beginning in that fake forest, when Shade and him save each other from Goth, which creates their mutual respect. Then, again, when they find Orestes managed to resist the call to land on a building and save him from the bomb strapped to his chest. And are just starting to talk with Orestes been captured by the vampire bats. That's it. You don't see him for the rest of the book until near the end. And when they free him, and at that point Orestes talks the other owls into teaming up with the bats and the rats. And it gives Orestes the idea of not just being a character, but being a plot device. And that's greatly disappointing for what that could have been done for him. This also ties a bit into the Nocturna prophecy. It feels like going into this book, Oppel really didn't know how to make this prophecy come true. So he just sort of didn't. Humans actually aren't here to help the bats at all. There isn't going to be this great war that will help the bats overthrow the heartless owls and gain back the ability to fly in the sun. And the real enemy is solely the vampire bats, not merely creating an enemy mine situation with them against the birds, or the birds and the owls and the bats learning to team up and getting over their prejudices to fight the much more dangerous vampire bats. At no point does it feel like the story in any way was really prepared to deliver on any of the promises in the previous book, nor did it feel like it earned any of these things it wanted to do. Again, I don't get the feeling that Oppel didn't want to, but more that he didn't know how to and just decided he didn't care enough to try. And this becomes especially notable when you realize Oppel doubled down on the Bat Gods being real definitively. They deliver prophecies that just aren't true. Like, not through twists of fate that they come true or anything like that. A perfect example is when Goth gets a vision from Zoth that shows him the future where he's tearing out Shade's heart and eating it in front of him, with the explicit idea, again, that this is a prophecy, a vision of the future. Except this just flat doesn't happen. If I had been writing this, what I would have done is made it so Cassiel, Shade's father, who'd been captured by the vampire bats, cloaked himself in a sound disguise as Shade to distract Goth, and sacrificed himself, creating a poignant moment where Shade and his dad are reunited, and his dad makes the ultimate sacrifice to save his family, both narratively earning his redemption after abandoning his family for his own personal glory, and then later on choosing his son over anything else. Or if we don't want to go that dark, he could have wrote that Shade was mastering his sound powers to the point that he tricks Goth into thinking he actually killed Shade, only to reveal that it was just sound, and Goth, who was wise to Shade's tricks, realizes, oh, he's a lot better than I thought he was. And this doesn't just extend to the prophecies. There's a big point that the bands the bats wear are gonna mean something later on. Now, obviously, as me and you humans, we understand that these bats are just tracking, these bands are just tracking the bats for human study. In the book, though, so much about them is built up to having this pivotal role later on. They just don't matter in the end. In fact, there's a number of bats who just get described as having a band. That's it. Overall, this created a rather disappointing experience for me. I can only award this book about a 6 out of 10. At the end of the day, Sunwing was a very disappointing sequel. I'm almost kind of glad I hadn't read it for as long as I have, because Silverwing had such a nice spot on my brain for a long time. I remember that book so fondly, and I think if I had read Sunwing, I don't think I ever would have had that fondness for it anymore. I would have realized that the ending is not all that exciting. And I realize I might be in the minority of this, based solely on the Goodreads reviews, but at the end of the day, this wasn't really, don't get me wrong, it's nothing to be deeply offended about. It's not bad. At worst, I can just say it's a meh follow-up. It just doesn't seize any of the potential it could have had. It doesn't deliver on anything in a satisfactory way. It's not terrible. It doesn't make me think, oh, this is why the series was never talked about, in the same way that it does with, like, the Elden Ring, the Elder Scrolls series. But so there's also Firewing, which is a prequel. Now, I'm hoping that's going to be a little more interesting. But I'm not as excited to read about it now that I did. And personally, thinking about it, I think it was better if my misconception had been true. I think if the story had been Sunwing is the first sequel and Firewing was the third sequel, maybe something might have happened. But I don't think this was a story that needed more time to bake. I think, like I said, I think Oppel just doesn't care as much about this version, this sequel. And it's not terrible. I won't recommend not reading it if you want to finish the series. And hey, like I said, I'm clearly in the minority based on the Goodreads profile. So maybe you'll find something in it that you'll love a lot more than I did. And if you do, great. I'm glad. I don't mean that sarcastically. I'm genuinely glad. But for me, it was just a disappointing follow-up. With that being said, just remember, every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. See you later, everyone.